Ethics, privacy, intellectual property, these are the themes shaping AI policy in the next decade. Luckily, Mr. Dominick Romano is here to demystify AI. Or are you a deepfake voice created with 11 labs and a video with Synthesia? How can we tell the difference nowadays?
Well, it's great to be here with you, Alex. I'm always excited to spend the time with you, like week after week, it seems now, where we discuss the latest and greatest things that are happening in technology between blockchain, between AI, between Web3. And there's so much just happening in innovation in these spaces. It's just rapidly moving, and it's really good to have a place like here to sit down and talk with someone like you who's another professional who really understands the markets and the space, and to go over these breaking news items, which really are, they deserve the attention.
With all these consumer grade AI tools, anyone with enough money for a subscription with $20 can generate a deepfake of themselves. Are the reporters on the news? Are they real? How do we tell the difference between a human and an artificial intelligent being?
So with everything going on, with deepfakes are on the rise, with an increase in fear amongst leading researchers who think that, super advanced artificial intelligence could result in the extinction of humanity. And then
Do
that
you
go
think
there.
that fear is overplayed?
Do I think the fear of, or do I think the fear of humanity being driven and extinct by artificial intelligence is overplayed? Personally and professionally, yeah, I do, and I think it's overplayed on two different spectrums. I think it's overplayed on the spectrum of, you have researchers who don't necessarily intend to overplay it because they are being responsible in their translating risk to the general public of something, right? But let's just say that they're being, the leading researchers who have like really helped lay the groundwork for these topics. They've had those years of knowing and seeing where we're going, right? So like, you know, they, they've had a little bit of that, like the foreteller's fortune of like kind of knowing where to look and kind of like what to be mindful of. So, when it comes to these topics of AI, we have to be mindful to take their advice into consideration. And then there's like, many of these guys are the forefathers, but then we also have to be mindful of the fact that throughout history, which has repeated itself numerous times, the leading researchers in topics struggled to explain things which were outside of the explainable. So, when it came to things that they could no longer prove in research, they would attribute that to God, or they would attribute that to a higher power.
Out in the gaps theory, where if
Yes,
there is a gap in science you can't explain, if there's a gap in knowledge you can't explain, you fill it with God.
yes, yes, exactly. So when you think about that, when you think about how that's been used throughout history in science and in technology or just innovation overall, even if it's not technological in nature, that's been part of the battle, right?
When I'm reading headlines, I'm wondering if it's clickbait. Will artificial intelligence end the world? It's good for clicks, but I do believe there are potential concerns or obviously risk for abuse, which is why we need to create a global regulatory framework to address AI. I recently read that New York City is one of the first cities in the US with a law requiring venues to inform consumers of biometric data collection. There's this reporter with the New York Times, I think her name was Kashmir Hill. She authored a book recently called Your Face Belongs to Us. And she was reporting that Madison Square Garden, for example, uses facial recognition to enforce a exclusion list to, keep certain people out of their venues. I think this scenario is one of the challenges that awaits AI regulation. But yeah, I mean, do you think AI might amplify biases around like race or gender, political?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've had the I've had the opportunity for the last couple years of speaking directly with a jurisdictional body in one of the large cities in North America, right? And the reason why I've been doing that is understanding really where the legislative and your judicial kind of will come together to see where AI kind of fits in that, right? So I need to really understand these things for, like you said, how are we going to be looking at privacy in inner cities? Are we going to be allowing facial recognition technology? I mean, do we kind of want that Big Brother like thing? And
Double-edged sword.
of
Because I
course,
could see the benefits of maybe allowing that technology to identify if there's weapons in a
for
school.
sure. But like what that actually, so what I leave that question to normally when I have these kinds of conversations is I try to leave that question to the actual country and jurisdiction that I'm talking about, right? So, like, I might not know the answer. Like, the answer in California and like Silicon Valley might be different than the answer in Paris, France, where they're going to be doing the Olympics, right? So, like in next year in 2024, they're going to be doing the Olympics in Paris, France. And when you think about like when you have an event like that you're hosting in your country, it brings a lot of people, but it also brings a lot of threats. And so, of course, there has to be a setup of that infrastructure for security purposes. And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. But, yeah, that right there is another example of like where it's like, okay, well, Europe is kind of in this position where, yeah, France is going to be hosting the Olympics, but the EU doesn't want the usage of facial biometrics. So you can't use people's faces to either identify them in any kind of capacity, either in a surveillance form or otherwise. And so that's where I can see where there becomes like this trickiness now between like the safety and security that and then the job that like a country like France has now for the Olympic Games in Paris, right? Because now you have where they're gonna have so many people and they might not have like all the resources to keep up with the moving intelligence of all the threats that could be happening. It could be happening it could be happening between now and it could be happening all the way up until when the actual games happen, which is like next year, right? So people know that the games are happening in Paris next year, and there could be people posting social media threats right now that actually mean it, and we have to be mindful of that. Like we need to be analyzing this data, and
Maybe some power to go through all this data.
yeah, no, there's not enough manpower to go through it all manually, right? So there will never be enough working years to process that data manually, like by a person. So for sure, we need AI to keep like these things regulated and to like really like analyze really large amounts of information. That's how you can determine you know, when content is getting way too toxic or way too severe. You could use it for some really good things there as well.
You mentioned the amount of data, which is also referred to as the new oil nowadays. But I would love to run artificial intelligence models through just basically data on the blockchain. But you brought up the privacy aspect of all this, and even on a maybe a more basic level, are corporations, uploading their trade secrets into these consumer grade AI tools? Are there national security secrets accidentally being uploaded into Chat GPT? It is so much easier to automate tasks that used to take an entire team to execute. What I do love about these consumer grade AI tools is that, if you don't have, any individual, regardless of the amount of capital they have, regardless of the resources and team, the next unicorn will be one individual in front of his laptop using 20 different AI tools. How do corporations protect their data if their employees are allowed to just run anything into ChatGPT?
Really good question. All right. So there's a couple of things that I would suggest, right? So first off, it's important that organizations have an understanding of, what data is pertinent to each employee and each person who has access to it, and what access groups that data is shared within, right? That's the first portion of this. Then you have where, you want to make sure that the data, the data that is being generated and amassed within these access groups and these roles, that's continually updating, and it's continually rolling, right?
Do you think the regulation in artificial intelligence is clearer overseas than in the US?
Yes, we actually touched on that a little bit probably in our last episode.
Anybody that wants to check that episode out?
Yes. What's the name of it again?
Beyond Blocks and Bits.
Awesome. Yeah. So that, as we touched on a little bit in that episode, there absolutely is a little bit more progress made in Europe right now for AI policy. Sure. And the same applies for blockchain and like your like Web3-ish GDPR discussions. Cause I put really your GDPR, data privacy, I put blockchain, data privacy, GDPR all in the same bucket because that's really where they belong. They really belong in that bucket all together. And then you have your AI bucket somewhere over here in a different area. Now, Europe has helped to really lay down some early framework and a couple different frameworks for helping to provide assurances to the innovators that the direction that they're going is going to end up being compliant if they just have faith in the framework that is being laid before them, right? And so what that does for practitioners is it helps the practitioner understand why it is that they're making certain design decisions in order to stay compliant with the things that are being designed into a system intentionally with an intent. And that's where like in some of these systems, they require intentful design of privacy and intentful design of certain components that are required for us, right? And like we had kind of touched on in the last episode, Beyond Blocks and Bits, is you had this period where like your blockchain technologies have kind of taken off now. We had our adoption of Bitcoin. You had your real spread of it. So now like all that the whole crypto phase has really hit. You had your 2009 2017 huge bubble. You had your 18 kind of fizzle, and then things have really built their way back up. And then now at one point we had a rally up to almost
69,000. They always, the common expression is that when your friends and families or the taxi driver wants to invest in Bitcoin or any asset, that's usually a sign of a top. You mentioned about, AI regulation being more clear internationally, which makes me wonder if if artificial intelligence jobs are also going to be moving overseas from the US. Because it's reminding me of Coinbase. They recently released a very informative website called americalovescrypto.org. And it's basically part of their effort to raise political awareness. And the site compiles about, a dozen different studies on the cryptocurrency market. They reported that around 52 million Americans currently own cryptocurrency, which is 20% of US adults. And believe it or not, around 60% of those adults were from the younger generation, the younger Gen Z and millennials, which I believe fall into the millennial category there. I think with the large user adoption by the younger generation, it really stresses the importance of proper regulation. And the reason why I bring this up is because there was a more sobering statistic where Coinbase found that due to the lack of regulatory clarity in Web3 in the US is currently at risk to lose around 1 million developer jobs and about 3 million non-technical Web3 jobs over the next 7 years over this decade as, Web3 development moves basically offshore due to the lack of regulatory clarity here. So I guess, yeah, my thought is, are we going to experience a similar issue in the AI space if the regulations are more clear elsewhere?
Absolutely. And I actually think that that's actually like it's a risk that the US government should be mindful of because it's these, it's a very this is very powerful knowledge. So, there comes a responsibility that the practitioners have to, you know, do right with the work that they do, right? So like, that's why we have this whole AI ethics discussion to begin with. It's just all about doing ethical work around artificial intelligence. We have a couple, I have so kind of like how you had mentioned with the offshore attraction of AI talent, given that or considered one of the leaders of artificial intelligence, just not only for a multitude of reasons. One being that like the work I do in the policy side of being able to take the policy talks and then bring it down into implementation, right? So, being able to take what we want to have happen and turn it into a system that works for all, that's inclusive. Like I'm able to do that kind of work and help there and then architect that. And then I'm also able to help in actually driving the actual research forward on the other side, which is what I do more on the AI for health side and the global initiative at the ITU, WHO, and the World Intellectual Property Organization.
Symposium in the US. Do you ever think about that?
Hold a symposium in the US. There's a couple of different options we have here because, I've been thinking about like, do we do one where it's like almost like an expo where you have different companies that come in and kind of show the best of what they have. Do we do it with where like when guests come over from overseas, right? So like here and there, I have guests that come from overseas. Do we welcome them by having an expo so that they can see the best and the latest and greatest of American talent? So there's a lot of different options there that I think would be amazing.
Viewers, thank you all for tuning into my Cryptocast, where we are here every week to explore the new internet. Please check out our social media handles and websites below. See you next week for more AI and Web3 insights.